Hello and welcome. This week we're going to cover another one of those specialty nutrition topics. And this is one that is extremely important because we are talking about nutrition that is not going to affect one, but two people. So for this, we are talking about mother and baby, or as we will be more frequently referring to it in the setting that we'll discuss it in this class and lecture, the fetus. So to preface, there are many people who are more qualified to cover this topic than myself. My understanding of the physiology of pregnancy as a whole is not great. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I worked with pregnant women at a WIC clinic in southern Wisconsin, which means that I've been able to experience pregnancy and childbirth from a close-up observer's point of view, but I will never be able to look at pregnancy as something that I have ever had to go through or ever will, which is something that gives anybody who has a huge advantage over me because they're going to see many sides of pregnancy that are completely invisible to me. However, I think that there is still some valuable information in these slides, and I hope that you are able to come out of this with something that you find useful or interesting in some way, shape, or form. So obviously we're going to take a look at pregnancy from the nutritional side of things. As we go through this lecture, we are going to touch only on the main points of pregnancy nutrition. We'll look at calories and protein requirements, weight gain recommendations during pregnancy, micronutrients specifically linked to pregnancy, and everything that can go wrong with the pregnancy if nutrition is out of whack. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this lecture, let's take a look at some of the terms that are linked to pregnancy. With the exception of the neural tube, none of these are that strongly linked to anything nutritional, at least anything nutritional that we are going to focus on, but they will help you have a better understanding of pregnancy as a whole, which is kind of a side goal of this lecture. So first we have a placenta, and that's an organ that only develops during pregnancy. Outside of that, it's just not there. The placenta sends nutrients and oxygen to the baby and removes waste from baby's blood. Uterus is where the baby or the fetus lives. It's a female organ that processes all stages of pregnancy. And it's where the fetus is going to grow and develop from the moment of conception until it's born. Then we have an amniotic sac. Now this is kind of like, if you've seen The Matrix, kind of like that one scene where Neo is reborn. And he wakes up in a big room and there's a bunch of humans in these little bubble-like things. There's lots of fluid in there. It's pretty tight. There's not a lot of space. That's the amniotic sac, and that's in the uterus. It's where the baby is, or the fetus is at until it's born. Trimesters, that is a 1-month period, and there are 3 stages in pregnancy, and these 3 stages are known as the 3 trimesters. Finally, the neural tube. That is the origin of which the brain and spinal cord will develop. So it's very important that that is developed appropriately so that the brain and spinal cord also become healthy and also develop appropriately. Like we mentioned on the last slide, a trimester is a 1-month period during pregnancy, and there are 3 total trimesters that occur during pregnancy. So each trimester marks a stage of growth for the baby as it goes from a few cells to a newborn baby. Now to back up, in going over this information, my goal is to give you a breakdown of what happens with the baby in the womb and explain why nutrition and specifically extra nutritional practices and requirements why they're necessary, and what they are going to help do. Now, in the first trimester, you're pretty much just dealing with a bunch of cells. This is the period from week 1 to week 12, and at the end of this, the fetus is 3 inches long and only a half an ounce. So through 8 weeks, the fetus is either a ball of cells or an embryo. That's it, which basically means that it's next to nothing, or that it looks more like an alien than anything that's human. Now at 6 weeks, that's when the neural tube develops. This is where the brain and spinal cord are going to develop from. At 7 weeks, baby's head develops. 8 weeks, nose. 9 weeks, toes. 12 weeks, toenails grow. And at this point, again, baby's about 3 inches long and 1/2 an ounce. Now, in the second trimester, baby is a more recognizable human form. Still not quite there, but you're getting there. This is the period from week 13 to week 26, and at the end of the second trimester, baby is about 2 pounds, 1 foot long. So it's much bigger than at the end of the first trimester, but still pretty small. Now at 16 weeks, baby's eyes move. At 18 weeks, baby's able to hear. 20 weeks, baby's about 6 inches, 11 ounces. 21 weeks, baby starts sucking thumb. 22 weeks, baby starts growing hair. 25 weeks, baby recognizes mother's voice. And that pretty much about takes us into the third trimester. And at this point, you have something that's very close to a baby, especially at the very end of it, obviously. At 31 weeks, you have rapid weight gain. 32 weeks, baby practices breathing. 33 weeks, baby can detect light. 34 weeks, fingernails grow. 36 weeks is a claustrophobic nightmare. Baby at this point fills up most of the amniotic sac. 38 weeks, baby grows toenails, and around 40 weeks, it's time to find a new home. You are out of here. A baby, when it's time to be born, is only going to weigh about 8 pounds, give or take, but most women need to gain 25 to 35 pounds during their pregnancy. So where does this come from? Well, unfortunately, to provide a little bit of a disclaimer, the image quality of this picture is not great, but I wanted to use it because it does a really good job of highlighting the breakdown of weight gain during pregnancy, especially as it relates to the weight gain through various trimesters, as well as the difference in weight gain that is related to mother and the weight gain that is related to baby. So, baby is going to itself contribute about 8 pounds, but the placenta, which is what the baby gets its nutrients from and also how baby gets rid of its waste, contributes about 1 to 2 pounds. The uterus, that will grow a little bit, and that growth will account for about 1 to 2 pounds. And the amniotic fluid, just that alone, the fluid that the baby is floating around in, that's 2 to 3 pounds right there. And there's going to be various accumulation of tissue that's grown from the mother. That's going to account for the breakdown listed below. But again, there's a lot of different things that are related to that weight gain. So a lot of times mothers are concerned about weight loss after a baby's born, but most of the things that were gained by mother during pregnancy are going to pretty much just drop off as soon as pregnancy is complete. There's a little bit of weight gain, a little bit of fat accumulation that occurs generally during a healthy pregnancy, which is a good thing, but that accounts for a very small percentage of total weight gain during a pregnancy. There are some specifics for the amount of weight gain recommended during pregnancy, and it may seem scientific as though it requires great precision, but the good news here is that generally, as long as overall healthy lifestyle and dietary practices are incorporated by mother, the body is going to self-regulate and control intake and weight to meet these very specific recommendations. It is important for mother to understand that this is not a time to be overly concerned with weight. A better focus is overall health and eating to feel full and feel good, and in doing that, weight is going to fall into place. But with that said, first of all, appropriate weight gain is based off of where a mother falls on the BMI scale. A low BMI requires greater weight gain than a mother with a higher BMI. I know the BMI is not a great tool, but it's also not a terrible tool for something like this also. If you're right on the border and say you have a BMI of 18.6, which is normal, but close to being underweight, and you gain 40 pounds during your pregnancy, that is probably more than fine. The problems generally occur when you're way outside of this range. So, mothers should gain about 1 pound per month in the first trimester, and then from there on out, they should experience weight gain of about 1 pound per week. This is going to be a little bit lower for overweight and obese mothers, and it's going to be a little bit higher for underweight women. And again, all this is based on BMI at the start of pregnancy. So BMI during middle of pregnancy doesn't really matter to us because it is a skewed number. It's taking into consideration the baby that's in mother, so it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So all this is based off of where a mother falls on the BMI scale prior to their pregnancy. Calorie needs are going to go up a little bit during pregnancy, and this is because mother needs to account for the growth of baby and then the extra maternal metabolic needs of the mother, and also some of the extra growth of the mother. So again, more calories required. Also more protein. Remember that protein helps with tissue growth. So protein is going to help the baby develop tissue, develop muscle, develop things that are essential for overall healthy development of a baby. One question that's worth asking we'll answer on the next slide is, does calorie intake need to be consistent throughout the entire pregnancy? Should they eat the same amount extra at the beginning as at the end? And are mothers really eating for two? So the phrase eating for two, it really, from a mathematical side of things, really isn't accurate. It's more like you're eating for 1 to 1.25 person. In the first trimester, there's no need to make any dietary changes. It's still very important that a pregnant mother get enough during this time period. Having an inadequate intake of calories and protein during this time can be very detrimental, but you don't have to bump up calories at all. And then in the second trimester, you should bump up calories by about 340 per day. And in the third trimester, just a little bit higher than that, up to 450 calories. And in both of those cases, it's important to not necessarily get a ton of protein, but just make sure that you're getting a regular amount of it. To give you an idea of what 340 and 450 calories looks like, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That right there would meet the extra needs for a mother in her second trimester. And then something like 2 Clif Bars is going to meet the needs for a mother in the third trimester. So no, not a bunch of extra sweets or a bunch of extra food. It's a relatively small amount extra that's needed during this time, but it still is a relatively significant amount. It's very important that a mother gets this extra caloric intake. And not like the mother has to be paying very specific attention to the amount of calories that she gets, but it's useful to know about what that extra intake looks like, so you don't under or overdo it during this time frame. So let's take a look at some of the things that are going to happen to mother and baby if a mother does not gain enough weight during pregnancy. And it's worth it to note that these things don't necessarily happen, but the mother and baby are at a much greater risk for having these things occur if inadequate weight gain does occur during this time. So first and foremost, it's important to note that pregnancy is not a good time to try to lose weight. It's very important that adequate weight gain occur. So the problems that are linked to baby for inadequate weight gain are actually very, very significant. Some of the more minor things are being born at a low birth weight, having slower growth after being born during infancy and childhood, having an increased risk of infection, and an increased risk for bone damage through things like fractures and rickets. So overall, what you can see is that a baby and fetus are less resilient and they're more susceptible to their surroundings. This could be as simple as being more susceptible to cold or warm temperatures, or it could be more complex, like a greater risk of infections, greater susceptibility to bacteria, and then later on in life, greater risk for chronic disease and mental health. But the biggest thing is that there's an increased risk for fetal and infant death with inadequate weight gain during pregnancy. As an adult, infants born from mothers that did not gain enough weight are more susceptible, believe it or not, to obesity. In general, they're more susceptible to metabolic changes. They have an increased risk of chronic disease later on in life, to diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, things of that nature. And they're even at an increased risk for psychiatric conditions in adolescence and adulthood, including depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. To understand this a little better, let's look at the Dutch hunger winter, which took place in the Netherlands at the end of World War II, 1944 to 1945, that winter. So during this time, the Netherlands were controlled by Germany, and due to various conditions that were very complex that were related to the war, and then on top of that, due to an early onset of winter, it was very difficult to bring food to this area. So the people of this region ended up having a very significant food shortage. And during this time, over 20,000 deaths were attributed to malnutrition that were caused by the famine. There were rations that were given out during this time. And if you look at the very bottom of the screen, you can see what those comprised of from a caloric standpoint. It was only 1,000 calories per adult per day in November, and then by February, it was down to 580 calories per adult per day. A very, very small amount. So we're talking like, if you go back to 2 slides, we're talking like just over 2 Cliff Bars per day. Like 2 Cliff Bars and a piece of bread is pretty much what that comes out to. So a very, very small amount of food. The reason that something like this is useful for us is because you're able to see malnutrition at very specific points of time for a relatively short period. This occurred over about a 6 to 8 month period. And so there were people that were being born, obviously, during this time in this population. And some of the people that were being born, they were in their first trimester when the famine struck. Some were in their second and third trimester when the famine struck. But what results of studying something like this are able to show are the differences in having a low caloric intake at different stages of pregnancy. Something like this cannot be studied in a laboratory or even in any setting nowadays. You couldn't get people to do it. Even if people actually agreed to do it, that type of research would never be published. There's too many laws and regulations against those types of research. It has to be a lot more, a lot safer to perform research nowadays. So what was found is that fetuses that were exposed during the first trimesters to these severe rations, they were actually more likely to be born at a normal birth weight rate. However, strangely enough, there were higher rates of obesity in adulthood, even compared to those exposed to famine during the second trimester. And they also had a very high likelihood of metabolic disorders and chronic disease, which is the same for the people that were born in the second trimester, but the risk was even higher for people that were exposed to malnutrition during their first trimester as a fetus. And this is for people that were exposed during this time, but then had adequate nutrition provided during the second and third trimesters. The fetuses that were exposed to famine during their second trimester, they were born small, and they were more likely to remain small as adults. They were also at risk for development of metabolic disorders, but not to the same risk level that you saw with fetuses that had this exposure during their first trimester. On the other end of the spectrum, you have excessive weight gain, and the consequences to the mother are an increased risk of developing gestational diabetes, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. They're also at a greater risk for skin tears and excess bleeding during childbirth. There's more pressure on joints. GI symptoms that are already bad, such as heartburn, become worse. And they're also at a greater risk for a condition known as preeclampsia. Consequences to the baby is that there can be some issues with the delivery. Baby is more likely to be born too large. There's an increased likelihood of childhood, adolescent, and then adult obesity. And with that, there's an increased likelihood of long-term chronic disease. Overall, excessive weight gain during pregnancy is generally less dangerous than a low birth weight, especially at the beginning or right around birth or during the pregnancy. But many of the consequences of excessive weight gain are going to rear their heads later on in life as the fetuses at the time of the weight gain, as they are more so exposed to time. And you can see some long-term physiological and psychological effects of obesity take place. There are a couple of health conditions that can develop during pregnancy. The one that we're going to focus on for the sake of simplicity and time in this lecture is gestational diabetes. To understand this, we should first understand what diabetes is, and this is impaired insulin function that results in very significant fluctuations, both lows and highs, in blood sugar levels. So insulin is what picks up blood sugar. So if it doesn't pick it up well, it can get too high. And then there's issues with lows as well. It's a little bit more complicated. We won't go into that. But it's all linked to insulin. The highs especially can result in impaired and slower blood flow. And so what you see in those cases is that there's a lot of sugar that's in the blood, and that makes the blood a lot thicker. And so instead of moving like normal liquid does, it's going to move slower, kind of like syrup. And this can, if you jump to the bottom of the page, this can lead to things like fatigue, um, mood swings, and then more severe conditions in people with like type 1, type 2 diabetes that results in nerve, eye, heart, kidney damage. It damages areas that have very small blood vessels because the blood is thick and it cannot move very, very easily through those areas. So blood is more likely to get pooled up. So for gestational diabetes, it's different than type 1 and type 2. It's a third type of diabetes, kind of like the type 2, but it only occurs during pregnancy. And this usually goes away as soon as a mother gives birth, and things like organ damage are less likely to occur in somebody with gestational diabetes than with somebody who has had type 1 or type 2 diabetes for a very long time. Fortunately, diabetes, and especially gestational diabetes, can be managed with relatively simple dietary practices, like general carbohydrate control, exercise, etc. If you were to ask a mother who has had gestational diabetes if it's simple to manage, they might disagree with me, but the point is that it's manageable with some maybe challenging but relatively simple things. The risks for baby are very similar with the risks that coincide with excess weight gain during pregnancy, but they're at a little bit higher of a level and a little bit greater of a risk of these things happening. Early birth and birth complications are more likely. Infant death can occur. A baby can experience, or is more likely to experience, low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, which can cause things like confusion, heart palpitations, shakiness, dizziness, blurred vision, and in severe cases, loss of consciousness and even seizures. And a baby can have some very significant difficulty breathing due to being in the womb of a mother with gestational diabetes. On the mother's side, if she has gestational diabetes, she is more likely to have high blood pressure, preeclampsia during her pregnancy, depression, increased risk for type 2 diabetes later on in life, mood swings and increased anxiety, and also hypoglycemia. Regarding micronutrients, the needs of these, at least some of them, are going to go up as well during pregnancy. Not a ton, but a significant amount, to a degree that's worth noting. So in this picture, you have a list of a description of the micronutrients that are needed in greater amounts and an overview as to why they're needed. The B vitamins are required for optimal metabolism, which is important considering that pregnant women should be taking in more total calories, so more needs to be metabolized. Vitamin A is going to help with fetal tissue development. Folate is a big one, and we'll go over this in greater depth on the next slide, but basically this helps with the development of very essential organs for the fetus. And then finally, iron and calcium. Both of these minerals, their needs are increased significantly during pregnancy. On the last slide, we talked a little bit about folate. At least we briefly introduced folate. And the reason that folate is so important is because it's needed for the synthesis of DNA, which is required for cell division to occur.
And adequate folate consumption is going to be critical before conception and during the first few weeks of gestation, because folate helps to promote optimal development of the central nervous system, of the heart, of a fetus's extremities, of their eyes, their ears, and other various body parts, including their teeth and then their genitalia as well. Now, we don't have to be too concerned about focusing too much on folate, because folate is added to a lot of foods nowadays. Even if it doesn't naturally occur in those foods, folate is still added. And then on top of that, if a pregnant woman is taking a prenatal vitamin, that's going to provide her with adequate amounts of folate as well. But folate, as you can see, plays a very important role in fetal development.
If things weren't already complicated enough, you have some difficulty taking in and processing foods that are more likely to occur during pregnancy. So you need more, but then also getting more can be a little bit tricky. Um, Pregnant women are at increased risk for nausea, cravings, or aversion to certain foods that go up specifically during pregnancy, frequent urination, heartburn, constipation, and then also weight gain or weight loss.
There are a few things physiologically that are going to occur during pregnancy for mother that are going to make nutrition a little bit more difficult. So these can include edema, morning sickness, heartburn, constipation, and hemorrhoids. Heartburn is common during pregnancy because the sphincter that leads from the esophagus into the stomach, this normally keeps the acid that's found in the stomach in the stomach. Because there's extra pressure coming up from the swelling of the stomach, this loosens that sphincter and it makes the sphincter more likely to open up, and that allows more acid to come in to the esophagus, and that's what causes heartburn. Now, constipation during pregnancy is also more common, and that's because the muscles of the colon become more relaxed and they don't work as hard, they're not as efficient. And so food items that make it to the large intestine don't move as quickly through the large intestine. Things get stuck and you have constipation as the resulting outcome. Prenatal supplements include a lot of vitamins and minerals that are needed for general nutrition, but also some of the ones that we talked about in prior slides that are needed in greater quantities for pregnant women. And you'll notice that vitamin B12 and folic acid are going to be found in prenatal supplements. And that doesn't mean that if you take a prenatal supplement during pregnancy, you don't have to worry about getting nutrient-dense foods. No, I wouldn't recommend that. But it just provides a little extra insurance that you're getting everything that you need without having to be too concerned about maybe not getting enough folate or B12 or iron in your diet.
That's all for this week. To begin my conclusion, I would like to first apologize. This is a topic that one set of PowerPoint slides can never do justice, especially a set of PowerPoints put together and narrated by myself. This topic could be, and probably should be, an entire class in itself. We just scratched the surface on all of the subtopics within pregnancy nutrition. We could go into great detail about gestational diabetes and preeclampsia, and we didn't even talk about preeclampsia. And really all of these subtopics within nutrition for pregnancy deserve much, much more. We didn't even go over the effects of alcohol, caffeine, and illicit substances on fetuses, but hopefully you are able to take away some useful points from this that may help you if you have a baby, or hey, it may even be useful for you if you run into a friend or an acquaintance that's looking for more information on this topic. So check in with D2L to see what assignment is coming up next. And if you have any questions, please get in touch and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, thank you very much for tuning in this week and have a good rest of your week.